Well, it's Mr. Dale here again, and we are now in Module 2. Remember that in Module 1 we talked a lot about salutations, greetings, how to introduce ourselves, our age, maybe our children, where we live. Module 1, very important base for Module 2. And so in Module 2, we will be talking about activities that we do during the day. So the objective of this video is to be looking at verbs, and more specifically at verbs in the present tense. And so after that, we will look at how to use present tense sentences in positive and negative. We'll also look at how to form questions in the present tense. After that, we will take a quick look at before and after clauses. And the final part of this video will be to talk about compare and contrast in our sentences. Well, as I said, this video will mainly be about using the present tense. And the present tense is used to describe things that we do routinely, things that we do often, maybe every day, every morning. And so let's look at some very quick examples here. Our verb eat is used in the present tense because we do it every morning, every day, routinely. Here's another example. Every day, I go to work. So we use the present tense form of the verb. I get up at 7 o'clock a.m. Simple present tense. She drinks coffee with her breakfast. Again, drinks is used in the present tense form because it's used routinely. Now, some people might be asking, why is there an S on the verb and not in these other sentences? Well, that is a good question, and it is a very important part of speaking and using English correctly. When we use the present tense, and only the present tense, there's one important thing we need to remember, and that is something called third person. Now, third person is the subjects he, she, and it. When we use these third-person subjects in present tense, we always need to add an S to the verb. I don't know why, but that's the rule in English. And if you want to sound like a native English speaker, you really want to figure that out and use it correctly. So I did say that third person was a very important part of the present tense. So let's talk a little bit more about it. Here I have I, that is not third person, so I simply say I eat toast for breakfast. But this box indicates our third person subjects, he, she, and it. So again, we need to add the S to the verb. He eats toast for breakfast. She eats toast for breakfast. Or it rains every day in July. Now, when we speak, that is a very important part of pronunciation, is to hear the S. We need to hear he eats, she eats, it rains. And then we go back to our non-third person subjects. We eat toast for breakfast, they eat toast for breakfast, and you eat toast for breakfast. So we have taken a look at the verbs. We've looked at present tense. We've talked about third person, and that we use third person for the subjects he, she, and it. So those are our third person subjects. And we use that in the present tense. Now let's move on and look at how we make positive sentences, negative sentences, and form questions correctly in the present tense. But before we do that, let's revisit this third person subject a little bit closer, because this will be important when we go to make our negative sentences and our third person sentences. I did say that he, she, and it are the third person subjects, but they can take other forms. For example, John would also be a third person subject because it is singular. Likewise, my teacher, my dad, the policeman, Uncle John, etc., they would all be third person subjects. Now, the challenge for us is to remember that in our speaking. And so we might remember to say, he lives in Quito, but it may be more difficult to remember to say, my dad lives in Quito. So we want to hear the S when we're talking about a third person subject. My dad lives in Quito. Again, that will be the challenge in our speaking, but if you can remember the third person subject and the S on the verb, you will sound much more natural and your pronunciation will be much better. Very similarly, she can also take the form of Laura, my mom, my friend, the nurse, etc. It can be a house, a cat, my room, the table, and so on. Well, let's talk about how to form negative questions or negative sentences in present tense. I do have a positive example here just for reference. We live in Quito would be a positive sentence. Again, he lives in Quito. When we go into the negative, we use the auxiliary verb do not and does not for our third person subjects. We got to put that auxiliary verb in after the subject. We don't live in Quito. He doesn't live in Quito. And I did include this sentence at the bottom because it is a very common mistake that people make. A lot of people say, well, this is third person. I need to put the S on the verb. But that is only true in positive sentences, not when we go to negative. And here is why. Does is the form for third person. We do not do it again in the verb. So this whole sentence is wrong. We will not do that. We will simply say he doesn't live. We can use the root form of the verb after doesn't. Okay, I do have a positive sentence here again for reference. Okay, she lives in Quito. They live in Quito, that is positive. But let's look at how to form a question in the present tense. Well, to make a question, we simply move this auxiliary verb to the very front of the sentence. It will become, do they live in Quito? Or, because this is third person, does she live in Quito? Likewise, we would never say, does she lives in Quito? That is simply incorrect, and we will not use that sentence. If we do want to make our sentences more specific, we can use a question word like maybe where. So where does she live? We've just made our question more specific, and we've used one of our WH question words. Again, we will need to know these question words for Module 2. It's a very important part of the vocabulary. You got to know the questions when, where, what, etc. Okay? So take a few minutes, make sure that you are familiar with these question words and what they mean. Well, we're moving quickly now. We've taken care of the positive, the negative. We've looked at how to form questions. Let's just take a few minutes now and talk about before and after clauses. Remembering that before is basically in Spanish, antes. I hope I spell it right. Before remember, third person goes, Here is our verb go. But it is third person, so we're going to actually add es to the verb, okay? So before he goes to work, he eats breakfast. So when you see that verb, it is simply the verb go, but it is in third person form. So remember, we are talking about before clauses, so we need to just remember that before is basically antes in Spanish, and it tells us when something is happening. Moving on to after clauses, it's very similar. We simply use after, or in Spanish I think it would be después. After he wakes up, okay, here he is waking up. After he wakes up, he gets dressed. Now again, these are verbs that you really need to know as part of Module 2. So take some time in your textbooks and make sure that you understand these verbs, because they are a very important part of Module 2, and we cannot really progress to Module 3 unless we have a good understanding of our daily activities verbs. So that is before and after clauses. Let's look at one more example. After, there's our after. After I wake up, what do? I eat breakfast. And just taking a very small moment, we also need to talk about the meals that we eat during the day. We eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Okay. I also notice a lot of our students are not using periods when they're writing. At the end of a sentence, we really need to use a period. One more example for before and after clauses. Before he, remember we need to use third person. Before he goes to work, he brushes his teeth. Now, brushes is a little bit different. Here it's actually es, and there is a rule. Any verb that ends, let me put brush here. Okay, this is the verb brush, ends in an sh, so we add es. It is the same for ch, for like watch. Okay, so he watches, or ss. Okay, he dresses. So we add es. Es for ss, ch, and sh. We add es. And I guess the same with this irregular verb, es as well for go. Okay, so we have taken a look at verbs in present tense. We talked about positive sentences. We talked about using do not or don't. Okay, don't or doesn't for negative. That makes our sentences negative. We talked about using do and does to make our questions. We talked about before and after clauses. And now let's just talk about comparing and contrasting. When we compare and contrast, we're talking about how two things might be the same, but probably how they are different. So in this example, I know that a mouse is small, and I know that an elephant is big. So when I compare it, I'm going to look here, I'm going to say a mouse is, and I want to explain that the mouse is bigger or smaller than the elephant. I would say a mouse is smaller. This tells me it's comparing smaller than. So when we do comparing, important to add the er to the adjective and the word than. So a mouse is smaller than an elephant. Let's take just a couple of seconds to talk about the article an. Why did I use the article an, not a? Well, the answer is very simple. It's because the noun begins with a vowel. If your noun begins with a vowel, we need to use the article an. So we would say an apple, an orange, an umbrella, but So let's see, an orange. Because this is a vowel, we're going to use an. Okay? There are some rules when we talk about making comparative adjectives. For example, we have this adjective hot, but when we make it a comparative, it's got a double T. And that is because the word has a consonant, a vowel, and a consonant pattern. Let's look at this one. Here's a consonant, here's a vowel, another consonant. The rule says we have to double the last consonant. Okay, so we would say bigger than, hotter than. That's one rule. The other rule is very important. If the adjective is one syllable word, simply add er to the end of the adjective. For example, we have hotter than, bigger than, taller than, rounder than. These are all forms of one syllable words. However, this is important. If we have two or more syllables, we cannot add er anymore. We're adding add more before the word. So let's just look at an example here. More interesting than. We would never say interestinger than. No, we would actually change it and say more interesting than, because interesting has more than two syllables. It's the same with exciting. Two syllables, so we're going to say more exciting than. Okay, we're not going to add er to a word that has two or more syllables. So that's how to form comparatives with one syllable words or two syllable words. So the man is, and I want to say he is tall. Well, tall is a one syllable word. Okay, it's one syllable. So I'm going to put tall here, but I need to make it a comparative to describe how they are different. So I'm going to say taller than the woman. Well, that is the grammar for Module 2. Let's just look again at the review. We've talked about present tense in this module. We looked at third person and how third person subjects are he, she, and it. And we also looked at positive forms of the present tense. We know to use don't or doesn't for negative. We also knew to use does or do when we make a question. Does he like apples? Does he go to work? Do they watch TV? We looked at how to use before and after clauses. And the last thing we looked at was compare and contrast. Canada is bigger than the United States. The United States is smaller than Canada. These would be examples of how to use compare and contrast. So that was Module 2 Grammar, and thank you for listening.